Take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. Welcome, students, teachers, and the generally curious to the 14th episode of the Constitution in American Life with the Friends of Publius. Congratulations to my Los Angeles Dodgers for their victory against the New York Mets and qualifying for their first World Series since 2020. I can tell by the vibes and the looks on the faces of all the fops that they share in the feeling of celebration. Yes, there it is. There's the celebration of my dear friends. So today we are going to be addressing the controversies and challenges that faced Americans during the 1780s under the Articles of Confederation. But before we get to that, let's turn to two of our favorite segments. First, we have the question of the day for teachers and students to discuss, hopefully in their classes or in their units or with anybody in their community. So here's the question. In your general opinion, does federalism inhibit or enhance the principles of higher law and rule of law? What do you think about that? All right. Yes, we got some quizzical looks. Could be a bad question, but hey, I like it.
Great question.
Yeah. Maybe we'll just do that one instead of the articles. No. We'll stay with the articles. So this day in history, this day in 1854, Florence Nightingale and 38 nurses arrived in Constantinople during the Crimean War to begin their servicing and what some might consider a major moment in a lot of different areas of history. So, Professor Williams, major, moderate, or minor moment in history? Florence Nightingale and the Crimean War.
Oh man, I don't have any historical context for this. So yeah, I mean, you stumped me. So I'm gonna go moderate just because I'm definitely not going minor because I don't think that's so I'm going moderate because I'm gonna bubble in the dot in the middle. There you go. That's all I got.
Yeah, I don't think, let's see, I don't know if high school, if the Crimean War was covered in your world studies class. And I'm pretty sure in college you probably didn't take a course that would have touched on it there. Professor Kavanaugh.
Mike, I like Mike's rationale here. I'm gonna go moderate. I think it's important. I think we would have gotten to a point with field hospitals at a certain point. Certainly, World War One would have dictated, and we saw that. I mean, brutality in field hospitals in the American Civil War. Oh my goodness gracious, that's just a terrible situation. So I think it's a moderate step, a positive step.
Professor Moore.
I'd go moderate. What's the tweener that Chris set up?
Mid-major. It's like
mid-major.
Moderate.
I think for a different reason. I think I've often been fascinated with organizations like Doctors Without Borders, volunteer organizations that go and have an international mission. That's fascinating to me at several levels. One, yeah, so I think this is a great example of activism, humanitarian activism, and with an international component to it. And I think there's a lot of that now. And I think I don't know whether this is ground zero on that, but I think this is highly influential on the international humanitarian activism piece.
I want to back up. I'm going to go up too because I'm now thinking about it. No, in a different sense, because I know that Florence Nightingale, is going to encounter so much pushback from men that she has no business doing this. What are her qualifications? So she actually, defends her ability to go do these things. So I'm going to go mid-major.
Well, if we've achieved anything, it's that we've had a day of education for Professor Williams. He now has a little bit of knowledge of Florence Nightingale. Do you want to talk about the Crimean War, Mike? A kind of I'd say a moderate mid-major event in 19th century, European history. Really relates to the Ukrainian-Russian conflict that's going on these days.
Yeah. No, I have nothing to say on it. I don't
Okay. Okay. Well, Students and teachers, we're here to talk about the Articles of Confederation, its controversies and challenges of the 1780s. And so let's start with our resident expert on the 18th century, specifically the 1780s. He's also pretty knowledgeable about the 1980s and the music scene there. So you could talk to him about that if you ever run into him, because he liked hair bands. I can tell you that. He loved the hair bands of the 1980s. So Professor Moore, would it be would it be accurate to say that the Articles of Confederation was first a war constitution, and it was never intended to establish a permanent system of government? If I wrote that in an essay in your class, would you accept that as a B answer?
No, no, and no. You just asked three questions. I thought you were going to ask two, but then you added the what? How would I grade that? I would send you to remediation for that.
Ooh, man, I've been in
I,
remediation most of my life.
I just, I'd be gentle. No, I think the articles was, okay. It was written during a war. But and I think I mean, I know there's some scholars that say because it was written in a wartime, we shouldn't have expected it to do much. It was done out of haste and desperation, blah blah blah. And I kind of disagree with that because, well, first of all, two things. Number one, the language of the preamble is they use this like perpetual. The word perpetual is there at least twice, maybe three times. I glanced over today. So there is this notion that this is going to last. Now the question is, was the America going to last, or was this particular constitution called the Articles going to be perpetual? And I think that's a fair discussion, but I'm prone to think that this was not a stopgap measure. The second thing I would point out is that when it went out to the states, there was a lot of rattle and hum at the state level about the articles, and they sent back. The states were supposed to ratify it. A lot of states took exceptions to statements in the articles, and the exceptions were kind of long term in their orientation. In very general terms here, they were many states were concerned about Western lands. Well, there's a future orientation to that, well beyond the war. So, and maybe I think we might be getting into eventually here in this hour of what kinds of proposals did the states have to amend the articles, but maybe we can get into the details of that. But my point is they're thinking down the road about the articles. They're not just immediately looking at it as a short-term rule book for wartime. And I also think the articles, and I don't know that this is a slam dunk to my view that it's a long-term document. There is an international component to this in the Congress. There's always this discussion of like Europe's not going to take us seriously. We don't even have a constitution. So I think there's a seed of a long-term vision in seeing the articles as providing European credibility for the war, certainly, but I think beyond that is what my argument would be.
Well, let me try to, recover some of my dignity here. And that is, I mean, there is, especially after it plays out and we get a new constitution, there's a sense that it's kind of slapdash. And again, it is about the international component. We need to be recognized, and therefore we need to have a constitution. But there's not a lot of deep thought or understanding of the consequences of the structure and elements to it. Does that would that be a little bit accurate
Well,
there?
certainly they underestimated how it would unfold in the 80s after the war in terms of commerce and cooperation amongst the states economically. So I think there is some validity to seeing it as but again, I would say that its shortcomings doesn't equal it was seen to be and was created for a moment in time and nothing beyond that. But the deficiencies, I think, is a good point, but I wouldn't equate that with it being a temporary war document.
So, Chris, I'm wondering, and again, I want you to choose here, and there's a method to my madness here. So
So you give me a binary choice.
I'm going to
Okay.
give you a binary. You can either have, all right, the the power to tax, all right, or the power or the enforcement power. That is, which is the word the major weakness in the articles? Is it the lack of taxing power or is it the lack of enforcement power? If it is truly a kind of a binary choice there, which I know it's not.
Well, honestly, Dave, I'm still trying to struggle with the idea you're trying to hold on to a shred of dignity with wearing a jogging shirt. But
Ouch. Yeah,
I'm just jealous. I'm just jealous. I'm just jealous.
You'd have to take off that shirt, but then that would lead to other issues of dignity.
Yeah, that's a whole First Amendment episode, right?
Yeah, we don't want to go into that. Yeah.
Does the answer to that is yes. Both of them are issues, but I would think that it's probably going to be the enforcement power, because, and I'm going to say some stuff, and then I'm going to let Tim correct me. But many states were paying their taxes, right? They weren't always paying them on time or as diligently as they maybe should. But you had some outliers in terms of not necessarily, hey, checks in the mail kind of thing. So I think it's more so the enforcement power to get states to comply with what they wanted them to do, and especially in terms of trade and in terms of interstate commerce and as well as foreign trade.
And again, I'm feeling that I'm walking on the cliff's edge here. These were not required taxes; these were requests, right?
Requisitions, right?
Yeah.
There's a big, and that causes the anti-federalist. That word switch causes the anti-federalists all kinds of grief, because requisition system is what the articles were.
Right.
So it's your point. I just want, Chris, it's your point that the requisition system was not being ignored totally.
No, it wasn't. I mean, states were paying the requisitions. I call them taxes, requisitions. I mean, we think of them today as you're paying money, right, to belong to the club, so to speak. You're paying your dues, whatever you want to, they're called requisitions, but states were paying them. Again, some were delinquent, some were not. Some were questioning the amount of the requisition, but those were being paid, not always on a timely manner. But I think more so is the enforcement power, the enforcement authority of a central government. Again, you're talking about a government that was formed under a firm league of friendship. That sounds more like a Facebook status than the way to form a government. So I'm going to go final answer, enforcement power.
Yeah, and just to be, I mean, obviously they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Because if you have a taxing power but no enforcement power, it ends up in the same place.
Well, it's kind of similar to the way the words are used early in early bills of rights, shall and should, right? So there's some of the things that are being written at the state level. People should do something. Doesn't mean you have to. No, it means you should do something. But when the words are changed to shall, it means you are required to do it. And I think that some of the language that some of the proposals that you will maybe talk about here in a few minutes change up some of that language to require the states to do these things and not asking them to do these things.
Yeah, I'm digging here for affirmation. So you would agree with me that of the myriad, and there's a myriad of issues with this Constitution and its provisions and stuff, that those two would probably be at the top of the list. That if they had included a taxing and enforcement power, all right, the Confederation government wouldn't have ended up where they had ended up in 1786, 87.
I think you have to be clear on what you're talking about enforcement. What would they be able to enforce? And that's why I wanted to talk about the idea
isn't there? Yeah, go
trade,
ahead.
Interstate commerce and trade, not only, trade among the states and trade with foreign nations. We should allow the government to enforce provisions that they had for that.
And there was there was no bureaucracy under the articles there was no court, where would you go? What court would you go to if you had a dispute between the national government and state governments about the requisitions that you asked? there's no tax collectors, there's no bureaucracy, there's no courts, there's no judges to try these cases. So the lack of enforcement, in specifically in the Articles case, means there's no bureaucracy to do any of that. Even though if you look at you look at the text of the Articles, and it does seem to be that there is this statement that you owe money. Well, we're requesting it and requisitions. I know there's some nuance between forced paying taxes versus requisition, but there's no apparatus to do anything, even if you take a generous view of requisition equaling forced taxes.
Well, is it possible for the Congress of the Confederation to, in essence, make some kind of trade agreement under the Articles? Could 9 of the 13 states, or would it have taken all 13, come up with some kind of commercial action of the Congress of the Confederation?
It depends on, well, they could have done it with 9 if you see requisitions as a loose definition. If you see requisitions as a tight definition, meaning a very precise thing, all 13 would have to agree to it, because you'd be changing the Articles if you thought requisitions equaled forced taxes.
Okay, so they could do that. 9 or 13 is an issue, but if you don't have an enforcement clause nor an enforcement bureaucracy,
yeah,
it's irrelevant, right?
I would
we'll never know. I don't think Robert Morris could have done it all himself, but
I liken it to the current Supreme Court's ethics code.
Oh, you got to explain to.
There's no enforcement mechanism, right? We're just going to rely on the virtue of the justices, just like we're going to rely on the virtue of the states to try and keep us together. And some states will be virtuous, and some states won't.
Right, and so that leads me to, in my simplistic binary presentation, to choose, like you did, the enforcement clause, because it seems to me you're saying the Congress Confederation could pass certain laws that might affect revenue, that might affect trade, but it's somewhat irrelevant because there's no enforcement mechanism within the constitutional structure to make the states nor the people follow those.
There's no Guido or Vinny to come around and collect.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That helps clarify. I was getting a little panicky there. So Professor Williams, the political scientist, let's get to kind of political theory. I know that's not necessarily your area, but you've dabbled in it a little bit. So from your perspective, are confederacies just inherently, structurally, historically weak, and thus just they're bad forms of government just to begin with? Is that kind of an accurate description of this form of government? They're just the worst form of government you could have.
Like you keep changing the thing. So
I'm still giddy from the game last night, and I'm not as clear-headed as I normally am.
Yeah, they're kind of like the Giants bullpen. They were structurally weak. They were inherently structurally weak. Yes, bad or worse form. I don't want to talk about that yet. But this isn't political theory. Like, we actually have empirical data on this, right? I mean, we have examples. There haven't been too many confederations in the modern world. I think there's a good explanation for that I'll talk about in a second. I mean, but 2 of them existed in the United States, right? The Articles of Confederation and the Confederate of the
States of America.
Thank you, Confederate States of America. The longest confederacy I could think of and find is Switzerland. And I don't think it's an accident that Switzerland is demographically located in a place where it was kind of protected from outsiders. I mean, it seems to me like the conversation we were just having, this kind of this idea of, oh, if only there was the enforcement power and taxing power, then it wouldn't have worked. Maybe, but then I wouldn't say it's a confederacy at that point, right? I mean, you just add on for me, the final piece would be the military that I think you need. So the examples of these entities, Germany had a confederation from about 1815 after the Congress of Vienna. It ended in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, of which another short-term confederation was there, and then the German Empire, first German Empire, was inaugurated in 1871. So we don't have too many examples. a lot of the reasons that Tim and Chris and you were just talking about are what made the articles um, inherently weak are the same that we found in other parts of the world, right? Um, there's a coordination problem. There's a collective action problem, like who is to make these different entities do what they're supposed to do. Um, there's issues when there's a crisis. How do you make decisions in a crisis when you have so much autonomy for different regions? I would also add that it's hard to form a national identity if you're going to try to have a confederacy. I think the other pressure though that I just want to mention is that it wasn't until like 1648-ish, right, the Treaty of Westphalia, where there's a growing consensus at that point that political entities are going to have boundaries, and once they establish boundaries, the goal of political leaders is to consolidate and centralize control within those boundaries. That's where the world was moving from the 1640s, right? If you are a nation state out in this world where there's more and more places drawing boundaries and consolidating control, and if you're one of those places that is allowing your regions to have a lot more autonomy, you don't have these decision-making structures, you don't have the bureaucracy to enforce, you are quite likely going to be a victim in this kind of global order. So I don't think it's by accident that we see by the 19th and 20th centuries, we see much more either federal or unified governments forming because the global climate, the global sort of political structures are demanding it. It's how you make yourself safe in the international order. So
Well, I guess where I need help is I learned something, and I don't know how many seasons ago from Chris and Tim, that the term United States is found in the articles. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So how can you have a united nation states or whatever with a confederation? I mean, they seem just inherently it's oxymoronic. How
They
can you
don't,
call us the
they,
United States?
United States didn't mean, the United States meant Confederation.
right.
That's what they meant.
Well, and doesn't and that's where I have a hard
Yeah.
time hanging on to the fish here. Is
Well,
wait a
it's
minute, how
because
can what does the United States? Go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry.
I don't know. I'm guessing that if the alternative is that there's going to be 13 separate nation states that are all going to coexist in North America at that time, I think again for what I was just saying, I think it's a lot of it is commerce. I think a lot of it is, well, we are now going to be threatened. Like maybe Virginia can hold its own, New York for a while, but what's going to happen? What's going to happen when the Spanish and the French and the English come and start wanting to take over? So I think the united part of it was an alternative to just 13 different nation states, which I think for a long time in our history was what the practice was. It was this idea that we're just all gonna mind our own business and pass our own laws, and we'll get together because we share a common kind of general history. But let's just do it that way. And I think that during the revolution, I think there was a sense of like, no, we have to unite in some other sense beyond having 13 separate entities.
Well, we see that in the language. Actually, the language is from the Declaration of Independence. I mean, the Declaration of Independence prior to the Articles calls us the United States, and that's exactly right. We have 13, independent republics, if you will, but they're not going to be able to stand individually against Great Britain. So we are United States in declaring our independence from Great Britain. And I've said this numerous times that not only are they independent of Great Britain, but they're also going to be independent of each other. And if you look in that last paragraph of the Declaration, there are, five things that by free and independent states they have right to do, and that's the, levy war, conclude peace, conduct alliances and trade. So they're listing out these things that nations can do, but they're united in this war front against Great Britain.
So isn't it more accurate to say that this is the equivalent to NATO? So we are 13 separate republics, but we have a military alliance.
Well, if you look at the behavior during the war, that was hardly a military alliance because if it was, it didn't work very well. Uh, I think there was some rumblings in the 1780s of actually morphing into three separate nations. You'd see these articles occasionally pop up in editorials in a couple of newspapers advocating that the vulnerability of 13 was too great. So maybe, there should be a northern country, a mid-Atlantic country, and a southern country. So they wrestled with this. I mean, it's a great question, David, as what was in their head when they said United States, with 13 separate sovereigns, one thing, or eventually would it be three things? So there is some squishiness, back to that word again, about what was in their heads when they're talking about this United States thing. I'm
Right?
sorry, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe a current example, one I didn't mention, is the current European Union. Maybe that's a better analogy. I think your NATO example actually is too strong of an example because, I mean, well, right? I mean, because there's an agreement about the military sort of uniting, and these nations have militaries. I mean, one of the issues right now with the EU is basically like how does the EU respond to Russia invading Ukraine? Right? They don't have a mechanism to really fortify that. So I think NATO actually would be much stronger case.
I always think of the United Nations because I always ask my students how much power does the United Nations have, and it has as much power as the member nations give it. So you think about our government under the Articles, how much power did the Articles government have? As much power as the 13 states are going to allow it to have. So I mean, it creates a
Huh.
very limited thing, right?
I was just thinking about the United Nations model, but it would have to be where maybe Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York were on the Security Council,
Permanent members,
right?
permanent
Permanent
members.
members, and
Yeah, they have veto power.
Well, the Virginians would and the New Yorkers would have been very happy with that. So
Well, kids, I think we've solved all the issues here, and we can. There
You
it
have to
is.
watch
Your
out for
answer
those
is
Western
either
Pennsylvanias.
NATO, European Union, or United Nations. There it is. There's the equivalent. So, Tim, uh, the as they're struggling through these myriad of issues, yeah, they have the meeting at Philadelphia, but my understanding is that there's multiple discussions about having multiple meetings of dealing with their problems that are arising. Um, and so that's the first part. Is that accurate that Philadelphia is it's the last, but it's sure in the first, and there's numerous
yeah,
discussions going on?
well, there's a lot of constitution writing in the 1780s. Well, starting with the Revolution. Uh, I forget the number, but I mean, Pennsylvania has two. I mean, a lot of states go through several cycles of rewriting new constitutions and stuff. So there's a lot of constitution writing, there's a lot of experimentation with various forms and different ways to write the Constitution. Would it need popular approval? So there's all kinds of experimentation going on with constitution writing. And most famously, you've got the Annapolis Convention. And well, in the Mount Vernon Conference, they met to work out some trade agreements between Virginia and Maryland, and thought maybe they could extend those agreements that they'd made to other states to sort out some of these trade wars that were happening. But even during the articles, even before the articles were ratified in 1781, it went out to the states. The same people that wrote the Declaration wrote the articles, John Dickinson, most notably. So it went out to the states, and like I made a list of all of the recommendations that the states had about the articles. Like now, Congress rejected them all. That's interesting. Um, but I mean, a lot of them were objecting to, like Maryland didn't like the extradition statement in the articles. We don't, a lot of states didn't like the tax policy. A couple of them wanted stiffer enforcement of tax. They didn't like the requisition system. There were a lot of states were concerned about standing armies. Who would command the army? Would the governors be in charge of the military? So there, even before the articles are ratified in 81, there's all kinds of suggestions to amend it.
Are
And
there greater? Are they greater than or less than the? I mean, the same thing happens in 87, 88.
right.
This
I
thing,
mean, that's a great point. So, if we get all cranky about anti-federalists wanting to amend the Constitution before it's ratified. I think a lot of people are like, well, what the hell was wrong with those anti-federalists? No, it's an up or down vote. Well, wait a minute. There's a long tradition of states griping about a constitution and wanting changes before it's approved. See article story. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean it happens again. And my view is my summation is yeah, well that's we did that. So what's the big deal about the anti-federalists griping about prior amendments? We did it during the articles. Yeah.
So I'll be honest. I guess I'm finally having a light. I'm just amazed that we put something together at all. Given the cantankerous nature of the American people and their representatives in the 1780s.
There was a 28 page, I mean, with the Constitution, Washington wrote an accompanying letter describing the Philadelphia Convention. We were amiable, we worked hard, we had, blah, 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 blah. It was like a paragraph, all right? There was a 28-page preface to the articles that went out to the states. 28 pages. And you talk about an unburdening of oneself, explaining how difficult it was to create the article. So, I mean, it is interesting to compare the 28 pages that preface the articles versus Washington's paragraph.
So
I think
Chris,
something
yeah.
you just said, David, made me think. I don't know in 1781 when the Articles are ratified that these guys actually saw themselves as Americans, right? And that the we, I mean, we think of being Americans, but I'm not sure if those guys are in their thought process are going to see themselves as Americans per se, like we think of Americans.
Right. I would say that they did a little bit, Chris, because they're talking about lands in the West as being the belonging to Americans. Now, not every state said that, but they did. There was this notion that there's this common domain that's us. Now, not the states where we live, but out there, there's an American piece of property. So
and
there's a little bit
there's
there.
money to be made off of that property.
Well, how American do you want to be, Chris? Come on.
Well, it seems to be, it seems to me that a consistent issue with our program, and it comes up all the time, is it's always, well, it depends on how you define the word. In our previous segment, it was all about, well, what does establishment mean? How do you view establishment? Here, when you say, did we think of ourselves as Americans? I don't know if we all agree on what that means today. All right, that we're still having the same argument of what does it mean to be an American. We might have had a real small sense of it in 1781, and my understanding is at least for Washington and Hamilton and to a certain degree Madison, that was one of their big goals, is how do we frame a system here to create Americans, to create an American identity, which became harder than I think. Well, they probably knew it was really hard, more so than we did. But again, I wonder if we've ever been able to get over that hump.
Well,
Especially given,
I think we're really Americans after times of crisis, whether it be 9/11, or whether you see the idea of the terrible hurricanes that we've experienced in southeast and in rural Western North Carolina, because you see an outpouring of support for our fellow Americans. So in times of crisis, there is unity. When there's not a different threat or crises, this is when you start to wonder about those people over there, those people down there, kind of thing.
so it's a brief state of mind. It exists very briefly, goes away, comes back.
Well, we go through periods of time where we're more American than not.
Well, I know Chris and I have argued about Federalist number 2 quite a bit over the years. John Jay tries to make the argument that we are, and he makes a cultural, economic, religious. He throws a lot of categories, Mike. Um, he throws a lot of categories of argumentation in Federalist 2, making the argument that we are united as Americans. Now, it's a fair discussion as to whether it's whether he's right or not, and that's where Chris and I maybe part ways. But there have been attempts, and I don't know that, well, I don't know that necessarily the 1780s was as big a crisis as the Federalists maintained they were, but John Jay is going to make the argument that we are at a crisis, and so therefore this American idea comes up in Fed 2, making the argument that we are united in these areas.
Well, building off of that, a few years back, in response to a question I had about the viability of the Articles, a highly respected scholar of the 18th century American history expressed to me that with some minor adjustments, all right, that is some reforms, probably the power to tax, probably some enforcement power, that the Articles could have survived as the foundational document of our American identity, at least until 1860, just like the other Constitution does. Chris, you agree with that?
Well, my first question is that a highly regarded scholar on our panel right now?
No, he is not, but our panel member knows this scholar very well.
Okay, all right, that confirms my suspicions.
Now, I don't know if this scholar was just playing with my head because he knew I was a dimwit and he thought it'd be fun to play around with my head there, but that's what he said to me, is that yes, it could have survived.
I know that scholar and respect that scholar very much so, but I'm gonna have to disagree. What happens even if we make these changes, and I'm gonna come back to this in a second because I've got a great list of proposals courtesy of Tim's excellent website, courtesy of Tim. But what happens when the spaghetti starts to hit the fan with the War of 1812? Are we going to resort back to the Articles document where we're united in war? But you already had states that were arguing. You already had states that were getting ready to throw down over border disputes. You already had this disunia, right? Not to mention this outbreak of democracy, which of course will cause that Federalist angst that Tim was alluding to. So I don't know that it would have made it to 1860, even with these changes, because there's a called the Grand Committee, and in 1876 they made 7 proposals to the Congress, to the Articles Congress. These are the changes that need to be made. Now it didn't go anywhere, but the first one they're talking about regulating trade among the states, interstate commerce, right? The second one they're talking about, hey, you guys, you gotta pay up a little bit here, right? We agreed to this, and you gotta pay up for your stuff. One of the provisions I really like is about if you don't pay up, right? If you don't pay up on time on your requisition, right? Because they use the word requisition. It's like they're going to accrue interest. It's like you don't pay your credit card debt or you don't pay your bill, you're going to accrue interest. None of the provision, like if you guys try and slow it down to the state level by not appointing these collectors, then we're going to step in. So you do see these provisions, and again, they don't go anywhere because you're stepping on the toes of the states, and I don't think they want to do it. There's also some other issues going on at the time that takes their attention. So I'll put a link to the show notes to these documents, but I disagree that it would have stayed because of human nature, and human nature being what it was. You already had states in border disputes. You had states, even though they weren't supposed to, they're in violation of the Articles by creating treaties with, trying to reach out to create treaties with other foreign nations. So I don't. Without a constitution, I don't think we would have made it to the Civil War under the Articles.
I wonder too whether we could have survived westward expansion. And every time we expand the issue of the slavery go in the West.
Well,
I don't know if the Articles could have handled.
Who gives up their Western land claims? Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, with these people, you had speculators that believe that we're going to be able to profit. I know we were joking earlier, but they did believe they're going to be able to profit off these Western lands.
Yeah.
And who's going to
But,
give,
but didn't the Congress of the Confederate show that they had some viability there with by passing the Northwest Ordinance? That was a remedy to Western lands.
Right. But when you compare those five eventual states with the amount of turf from Mexico, Oregon, California, I mean, there's precedent for Congress to solve that problem. I just don't know, because remember, one of the provisions in the Compromise of 1850 was Congress is washing its hand of all jurisdiction about the status of slavery in the West. So I see that as a real, I mean, I don't know ultimately, but I have
Right.
some real doubts that Congress would have been able, under the Articles, to solve any better
well,
than the Constitution Congress.
and that's why Tawny in Dread, that's why he doesn't strike down the Northwest Ordinance that outlaws slavery, because he said that wasn't created under the Constitution. It was created under the Articles, and therefore the Congress, I'm not ruling on the constitutionality of the Northwest Ordinance because it happened under the Articles Congress and not the Constitutional Congress.
So, Mike, given, and I kind of, when I thought of this question, I thought it was a great question. And now that I've listened to you guys, I realize it's like probably not so great of a question. I probably want to change it, but I am wondering that given the significant divisions today, and we kind of just talked about this of, are we a united people? And I don't think we are. I don't know, other than what Chris said, we have these moments where we might be. I'm wondering if a confederation might not be best for the future of this country. Go back to independent, and because that seems to be where the love affair is. People say, "Oh, states should be able to control their destiny and stuff like that." Some kind of modified confederation, maybe with some trade clause, I don't know, there. But it seems to me that sustaining a nation state this large and this diverse, both geographically and within our own and identity wise, it seems to me that we're better suited to either breaking up into 50 different republics, or maybe to Tim's idea, maybe rethinking nation state and having, maybe four nations here. What do you think about where we are today and the status of the United States?
Yeah, and I do think it was a good question when you wrote it the first time. I think it's a good question right now, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah. My bottom line is it's going to be no, I don't think so. But let me kind of go through some of my rationales. First of all, it's hard for me to even get my head around that process happening. So just actually the actual mechanics. Do we have the political culture to support that kind of discussion in a way that would actually be fruitful? We're much more of a small d democracy, obviously, than we were back in the 1780s, and I think that that's both for this process that I'm imagining could be both good and bad, right? Because there's going to be a lot of different voices. So it's hard for me to think through what that process looks like. That's my first objection, why I'd say no. Second, and this is going to reveal my own sort of politics on this. I would like us to become. I like there to be more centralized power on some issues because I think there are some things that are left in our federal system to the states that I think I'd rather have a unified approach to it rather than a more federal approach. And then leading into that is the world today, both the economic, social, environmental world we live in, I don't think it would bode well for us to actually address the issues that we're addressing if we were to adopt a Confederate model. I think we would make ourselves very much a threat to other global superpowers. I think issues like climate change and other issues, or God forbid another kind of like pandemic. We're not in a place in a confederacy that we could actually have the collective action to solve that. Now, this question did also get me to think, and I think this is where you're coming from. Are we just are we kind of a confederacy in fact? When we all watch the news every night and look at the states, the colors, right? And we look at what both blue states and red states are doing by basically just ignoring the central government, right? California says, "Oh, we'll do our own environmental policy. Like we'll set up our own regulations. We don't need you, Trump administration, to tell us." And we have a lot of red states, just pointing the finger at the Biden administration right now, saying, "No, we're not going to do what you want us to do." So are we actually, whether we like it or not, living in a confederacy in fact? And should we just tear off the Band-Aid and do it? And then my final thought on that is when I think about that, I think about what happened in in India with the partition. And I start thinking about the actual what that would look like for someone like yourself, David, who maybe would be like, okay, I'm get out of this part of California and get myself to another part of California to where I could live under the laws I want to live in. Like, what kind of chaos would that actually cause on this continent to have people moving into different locales to get into that blue or red state or district or whatever? It just scares me to think about unleashing that kind of force. I'd rather kind of just live in the Confederacy in fact that we have, try to just keep educating folks to get to a place where we can talk our way out of this, rather than unleashing a convention where we're going to talk about this. Then I think it'd be utter chaos in this political culture.
Well, aren't we kind of doing that now? Aren't people moving? Aren't people voting with their feet now? And we're self-selecting communities and places where we see our values reflected in our neighbors.
I don't. Look,
Well,
that's
a lot of Texans, all those Californians moved to Texans. I don't know.
yeah.
There's some cultural pieces there that are interesting.
I don't know. I think maybe, Chris, there's such an affordability issue. I think people are going to buy homes where they can.
Yeah.
I think
Well,
a lot of Californians are moving to red states like moving to, I guess it's a purple state now, but I'm thinking about North Carolina. A lot of my friends are talking about when they retire, they're going to go to North Carolina. And it's not about the politics. It's about, well, that's where I can afford to live. So I guess I'm getting at what is the actual cause that people are moving? Is it political or is it more just economics?
I like it. I like, in fact, we're Confederate in fact, Union on paper, but Confederate in fact. Professor Moore, you have a grin. I'm just wondering, what do you think about that?
Um, I got to tell you, Mike's point about the partitioning of the Asian
India.
subcontinent. I mean, wow. I had never thought of that. The absolute chaos that would happen.
Just think about the entire nation looking like LA freeways. It would be, Mike. That's a really good point there. And in the realignment, what would that look like?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, just something else. So come to the end of our hour, gentlemen. So some thoughts, recommendations to students and teachers on question 2 or unit 2, question 3. Professor Kavanaugh.
Well, many of the questions are, I don't know if counterfactual is the right word, but you're thinking, well, what could have happened, right? What could happen? Hard to say. And I've said this before. I digress a little bit. None of this was predetermined. None of this was inevitable. And this time frame, as much as any time frame in American history. Well, of course we're going to have the articles, and of course we're going to say they don't work, and of course we're going to write a constitution. Understand, students, there's nothing is inevitable, and it was only inevitable because it happened. But again, a lot of this is speculation, wondering, could the articles have been saved? Could we have tweaked them? And what were the pros and cons of the articles? Were the articles merely a war document? No, I think that this was a group of people coming together, taking a step that had never been taken before, and we need something. And I agree with Tim. The word perpetuity or perpetual is used in the articles, and they believed it was going to last a while. But then they were practical enough to realize, well, some were practical enough to realize, what we've got is not working. Maybe we should, think about redoing these. And this is how we end up, obviously, through some fits and starts at the Constitutional Convention. So I would, and I've said this before. So do we need to rewrite our Constitution now? Why are we being governed by a document that was written in 1787? Think how much we've changed. My goodness, think how much the country changed from 76 to 87, 1776 to 1787. And these guys were not fearful to try something new. And yet we're still living with this document, that was designed for a nation of what, 5 million, 7 million people, and a big part of that was in a slave population. So how would we rewrite the Constitution today if you believe that we need to rewrite it? So,
Professor Williams?
Yeah, I mean, what I like about this question is every time we have this question, I think, especially, I think it's Tim and Chris, there's a lot of myths about the articles. And I love it that I learn a lot every time we do this, just about the articles they're not as bad as as people kind of think. They just kind of, oh, the articles. No, I think there's something there to appreciate and something to learn. And what I was thinking about during this was like, and I know Tim lives in this world, right? I'm just take the Declaration of Independence as just the starting point up through the passage of the Bill of Rights. The kind of constitutional discussions we were having in public and the changes we were willing to make and the risks we were willing to take. And it just made me think through, I am pessimistic that I think the Constitution does need to be written. I'm very pessimistic that we have the political culture that would support the skills, dispositions, and knowledge to actually do that. And that's sad coming to that realization, because I think then our institutions by their nature are sticky after time, but they don't have to be. I mean, societies change their constitutions all the time. And the fact that maybe we're not at a place culturally, I would argue, to have that kind of debate and not have it end up in utter chaos or violence. It's just, to me, it's just sad that that's where we're at in 2024.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, I just have two thoughts. I know there's been a bunch of work done over the years. The people, and I think mainly political scientists have speculated, hey, let's take the continent and let's redraw it. One of the first thought experiments that was done, it was actually written by a journalist by the name of Joel Garreau years ago. He speculated that there are 9 nations in North America. So he wrote the book called 9 Nations of North America. And it was a really, I mean, as a young man, I was quite fascinated by this. And he makes a combination economic, he makes it cultural. But so students glom onto some of these thought experiments that political scientists have done. To Chris's point, people, are these risks worth taking to redraw these boundaries? So I would recommend students in Unit 2 get a little presentism going there and think and investigate these experiments that some people have proposed in redrawing the maps and redrawing the cultural pieces of the landscape. Another thought experiment I would say is, for this unit, it might be worth your while, students, to compare the articles to the Virginia plan and compare the articles to the New Jersey plan. And I think you'll see, and in doing that, I think you'll have some ammunition to answer some follow-up questions, certainly maybe about the convention. But I think the plan, looking at articles and compared to the 2 dominant plans that occurred at Philadelphia, might be an interesting thought experiment that would deepen your historical understanding about these systems options.
Well, students and teachers, the only thing I could add is just to echo what I thought was pretty insightful by Professor Williams, is thinking about the generation that lived through the Revolution and the Confederation into the Constitution, and their spirit, kind of their soul of the nation, kind of thing, and their ability to have generally an open mind to ideas and change. And no, it wasn't easy in any way, shape, or form. And given where we are now, and it's not just the Friends of Publius, you can open a lot of journals and a lot of scholarship out there that people are wondering, all right, what kind of changes, given the nature of the political culture, what kind of changes might we need? And I think, Mike, you got to the point. Do we even have the aptitude as a culture, as a people, for those changes? Do we have the virtue for that? So that's something to think about, students and teachers, as you go on. Hopefully, we've helped you a little bit frame this. When we see next time, we're going to be dealing with legislative representation, and we do plan on having a bonus segment where we're going to kind of get into this a little bit more about the coming election and the Constitution, and some questions about guardrails, and is this truly the most important election that you'll ever face, which is being said on a daily basis. Well, until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos, go Dodgers, bye bye, bye bonds.